Cool. Hi, everybody. We're going to get started now. Just a couple of quick housekeeping items. One, we're not taking, or we're not going to be answering questions during this time because we want to spend all of it getting as much out of Mike directly as we can. But if you do have any questions, you can put them in underneath the video window right here. And after the session, we'll do our best to answer those. And also, we're being recorded, so you'll be able to catch the replay probably in a few days. We'll have it up. So before we jump in and start grilling Mike with a bunch of questions, I wanted to set the mood. So a couple of years ago, actually, I think it was like almost 6 years ago, Tableau had their annual conference in Seattle and rented out the whole grounds of the Space Needle for their Data Night Out party. And when the party ended, Mike and I happened to bump into each other. And eventually hopped in a cab, and he took me out to somebody's apartment, and I didn't know where we were going because I don't know the city very well. By the time we got up into the party there, I looked out and Seattle was, I don't even know how far away. It was just a dot. So having said that, I hope that this discussion also leads us to some strange and interesting places.
Yeah, I'm quite sure it will, Lee. Quite sure it will.
You remember that, right? Or maybe you don't. I don't know.
I have to admit, a little more fuzzy than I would care to admit. Hopefully this isn't being recorded. But yeah, that was...
It was Jesse's apartment.
First Tableau conference. That was the third or fourth Tableau conference.
Yeah.
So that was my second or third, the one of the Space Needle with the music experience.
Yes.
So that was a lot of fun.
It was fun. So, all right, let's get to it. Now, we've known each other a long time, so I've kind of been able to see the different places you've gone, and you've worked for mostly companies that I would consider to be kind of innovators and disruptors in their fields. But what I see with customers, and maybe you see this, is that when they're using these new technologies, they think, oh, this is the one that's going to solve my problem finally. And that's all it's going to take. And I've seen this so many times, and I bet you've seen it, that people have to change their behavior also, and maybe even how they work together to make that technology successful. So, and that change is hard, right? We know that generally. So can you share a time that maybe either with a customer or for yourself, you had to kind of work past your own comfort zone and to change in some way? And why was that hard for you?
Sure. So looking at it from my point of view as well as a customer point of view, I think there's a little bit of a parallel. So I'll start with mine. And this was going back to the Tableau days, selling disruptive software that had, from a software sales perspective, a land and expand model. So Tableau Desktop is really easy to use. Someone can buy it and then at least use desktop for as long as it makes sense. And then there's a platform that you can lean on. So that could be Tableau Server, Tableau Online later on in the years. And that's where the expand comes in. And one of the big adjustments was coming from more of an enterprise sales, enterprise deployment perspective, where you did do really big initiatives. This flies in the face of that. So you start with small initiatives. That enables smaller teams and grassroots efforts to make an adoption happen. But the thing so that was the big challenge that I had. That also parallels to how customers use this kind of software. This could be at Tableau, Snowflake, Alteryx, all have the similar kind of not only scale large, but also scale very small aspect, which promotes that land and expand model. but just getting the idea of being able to start small and being able to make mistakes, and that enables moving forward, which it took me a while to kind of figure out those two parallels, and I thought it was really interesting how they actually wind up being very similar, because what folds in later on is the top-down aspect. Considering enterprise deployments was a very top-down thing, modern analytics software, to use Gartner's term, whether it's modern BI, modern data warehouses, modern analytics, is something that can be bottom-up or groundswell, grassroots type of efforts. But that doesn't mean you have to throw out the top-down aspect out the window, because you can do all of this great stuff, pick your analytics software. But if no one is talking and truly making decisions with that software, or at least with that process in mind, it doesn't go very far.
So how did you kind of deal with that idea of being able to make mistakes? Is that something that was kind of either difficult for you to be comfortable with, like, especially if you're the person helping the customer? There's always this idea of like, well, we're going in and we have to make sure we look like we know what we're doing, especially early on, right? When you're really maybe getting those early adopter customers as well, where it's a lot of those solutions are more established. So for yourself, and then also maybe even more so for the customer to be okay with it.
Yeah, the early adopters do help, because if you did make a mistake or you say, I don't know, you actually have to get to that point. An early adopter would just say, okay, let's find out. And then both of you go and figure it out. And that's actually, one of the more fun aspects of doing what I do. You do have to be comfortable with making mistakes and understanding that those little cul-de-sacs, mistakes, call them what you will, are sometimes necessary. And it kind of harkens back to, I don't know if you've seen Chris Stolte's presentation on the cycle of visual analysis. That speaks to that messy process of making mistakes. And I've had many a customer say, it took me 11 iterations to get to this answer that I was looking for. And there's no way I would have gotten there if I didn't have the 10 mistakes that occurred to make that happen. So what the important thing to do is to make that process of vetting out those mistakes as fast as possible. It goes back to the fail fast, fail often type of aspect. Not like you're looking to fail, but the important thing is recognizing when you just didn't hit the mark for whatever reason. See what you can do to course correct, and then make it a little closer the next time.
I think part of that too is that for people to adopt that, especially at the enterprise level, is failing, but not just the act of failing in the sequence of doing and trying new things, but failing in I will say, a measurable way, right? There's failing like you just do a bunch of stuff and, oh boy, it failed, right? And then there's, well, let's do this in a bit of a systematic way and try things, but knowing that there's a good likelihood we'll fail, but we can understand why we're failing too, right? So there's more control. Have you seen some things like that? And is there anything that you could maybe give to the audience that they could keep in mind, or something that they should be looking out for in what they're doing in this way?
Sure. So there's two things. The first one, kind of take back to my project management days, back doing project engineering. There is a concept of work breakdown structures, where you have a big goal, and let's just say it is, I don't know, increase market share by 5% or something like that. Then you can start breaking that down into steps as to how you would get to that end goal. At a project management perspective, it's usually getting a project done, say deploying a series of servers or something. And then you would figure out, okay, I need to procure this, I need to provision this, get steps A through Z. So the importance of that part is you don't look at the end goal, but you start figuring out what are things that are going to get me to that goal, but what is that next step? Then you can create measurement, analytics to find some correlation, maybe drive to quote, and then use that to prove causation or not. Because maybe the idea is a marketing campaign, and then you need to figure out whether or not that marketing campaign made sense. So it's also then another aspect of that, it kind of brings you towards Six Sigma, Kaizen, and some incremental improvements. The other aspect of it is just the sheer of making mistakes and understanding when you are in a mistakeful environment where maybe mistakes are going to happen versus when, when you're in a situation where maybe it's a production type of analytic system where it is vetted, it's a bit more operational, so it needs to behave consistently, not experimentally. Yeah. And knowing when you're in between those two worlds, which is more of the cultural aspect of doing modern analytics.
Yeah, that make all those things make sense. And I guess but kind of summing that up, it requires you to really understand at a finer detail the way the work is getting done, right? Because you're saying I'm going to break it down into pieces. That's quite different than maybe what people are used to doing, just kind of doing their work, and they're not really dissecting it and thinking about it, like how all those little pieces might interact with each other. And each of those can be, if you really wanted to, could be a test area, right? You could really get down to nitty gritty and say, we're going to test here, 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 all along the way, which a lot of marketing people are used to, right? If you think about funnels or changing something on a website, right? Oh, I'm going to take the color of the button. Well, I got to test and see if it's good, if the blue or the orange button works better. I think there's a lot of things you can learn from already that are out there. It's not like this is something new just for the analytics world. It might be some new thinking and process stuff that people have to deal with. But a lot of the probably approaches, like you said, work breakdown structure and other activities are probably out there that are good parallels that we could steal from. So, all right, let's move on. I'm going to save my favorite for last here. So kind of back to the technology stuff. Again, kind of, you've really been in the field of analytics for a long time, and you mentioned a couple of companies you worked for. So Tableau, that's where we met. And you've worked at Snowflake, and now you're at Alteryx, which I'm pretty familiar with them. But and all of those, while they're in analytics, they're all quite different in terms of the problems they're solving and kind of what the technologies do, of course. But I have a feeling that with each of these technologies, there's some similar customer behavior. So let me kind of get it to what I mean. I'm guessing that there's times when you're on a project, you start in, because you're usually kind of early on these projects too. So you're seeing a lot of kind of raw stuff at the customer, where you're coming in and you're assessing what's going on, and you end up saying to the customer, I see this pretty often, and I think if you make this one change or a couple small changes, this is really going to help you start the process, right? It's not like we have to come in and do a massive thing right off the bat. So is there something either in common across that you've seen, just as a kind of a general thing, or maybe there's just a particular story you want to share where you came into a customer and kind of told them something that they could do, and what was that, and kind of how did it turn out?
Yeah, so probably I would say more general, because it's a bunch of tiny little things, especially being on the sales side. I haven't done any services since the early in the Tableau days, 2008, 2009. But it's similar to a previous question, oddly enough, where a lot of people will look at a system, this could be Tableau, Snowflake, or Alteryx, and think, I need to do a really big thing. And there's a bit of analysis paralysis as far as how do I take this big chunk out, as opposed to getting started with a quick use case. Thankfully, that's a conversation that happens less and less these days because people are really understanding incremental improvements, low-hanging fruit. There's a bunch of ways that customers look at it and make their achievements. And it's a challenge on the sales side because maybe that slows the larger sale, but the important thing is that the customer is actually getting value for the software each and every time. And something that's making this more important from the customer side is just the general SaaS model, because what that's done, at least from my perspective, and I'd love to hear if the audience chime in on this, to me, it feels like it's more of a buyer's market, a customer's market, because the vendor needs to really prove themselves on a contractual basis. So it's not you've purchased a CapEx piece of software and in 7 years you'll reevaluate it. It's a 1-year subscription. It's a 3-year contract, and you need to prove your value each and every year, each and every time. So it essentially makes everything more incremental. So on the customer side, which drives it to the software vendor side to always provide value one way or another. I see that as a mindset change. So that's why in the earlier days, that would be something that would be exactly the topic that you were asking about. Just you need to make this change. And thankfully, it's gotten better over the years.
So I could see that, because because now customers are able to do things, to buy incrementally too, right? Mm-hmm. So it's not just about testing incrementally. It's they might do that, say, okay, let's start here and move our way up. And as we see things, and then you get into all the issues about customer retention and things like that. So is there something that you found particularly helpful in setting that up, right? Because it means success for both of you, right? The customer obviously is interested in what you're doing, so they want to see if it's working, and of course you want to see that it's working. How do you kind of come together to help them make sure that they're getting something substantial enough done as well? Mm-hmm. That's going to show, right? Because you can, if it's too small, right, they might keep doing these little things and you never get anywhere, versus not the big thing which takes too long. How do you get to that middle point?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, because that drives toward more adoption in centers of excellence. For a wider point, let me get more to your question. That comes down to essentially the marriage of bottom-up analytics and top-down executive sponsorship. So you wind up needing to find something that's interesting to people in the front line, so something that is a grassroots effort, but also provides value to the company at large. And that will be on the radar of somebody that's in leadership. So getting the combination of the two is the great, intersection point for good projects and use cases to get done, especially in the early stages, because you kind of have to score big when you're doing these initial projects so that it gets people's attention. So there's lots of problems to solve in every company. So it needs to be something that sounds like it's usable in other, not just a single use case, but in many use cases. So, again, getting to solve problems that are not just incremental improvements for someone in the front line, but something that's a little more strategic.
So how do you, I'm curious, do you feel that there's a sponsor who is, I'll say, knowledgeable enough or aware enough about that to know success when they see it? Or is it kind of,
That depends. I see that driven by people's ability to abstract. So if early adopters look at a piece of technology and say, this is going to be the next big thing. I know I can do something with this.
Mm-hmm.
They have the ability to take a Superstore demo in Tableau, a basic demo in Snowflake or an Alteryx, and say, I know I can solve my problem, even though you're just showing me something truly generic. That also follows through with sponsorship as well. So it's either that you need to understand that you can solve the problem, or that sponsor can trust the person that's doing the work on the customer side to enable them to try to find some success.
Yeah.
So
I like this. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Oh, yeah. I was just going to say, finding those situations are the challenge. So it comes down to just asking lots of questions. So I try not to stop at my use case, or the use case for my customer as a dashboard or an analysis. It's like, what are they doing? They're doing churn analysis. Who is it going to? How is it being used? And that helps you understand who it affects. And the more people and the more rich that story winds up being, typically it's a better use case and it has more impact. I'm sorry, you were going to ask another question.
Yeah, no, I was going to make a comment about, you said that these two questions were related, and I'm picturing this idea of that idea of the work breakdown structure you mentioned of being able to divide a program up into pieces. So I could see this idea that you're talking about, how to prove it, where you say, okay, we have to make some assumptions about what that success is, or get to that bigger picture, but then you break it down, right? So then you can chop it up into smaller measurable pieces to go along, and proving that value along the way to the sponsor, right? So I think if you, instead of going to that end and then kind of pulling the curtain back, the big reveal, hey, this is what we got, you're saying, look, we've got these these spots along the way where we're still achieving something as well. And I think that could be a pretty effective way to engage, to keep moving your learning, and can give some experimentation while still keeping the sponsor engaged. That it's not just going in the right direction, but they're seeing something tangible out of it, like that.
Yeah, because there's lots of aspects that you're trying to solve for that you don't really know while you're trying to solve it. So
yeah,
do you have the right problem statement? Are you trying to solve the right problem? Is the incremental, that work breakdown, is it the right size chunk or the right type of chunk? Are you using the right measures and dimensions to measure it?
Yeah, I like that too. I'll just close on that point. That I'm going to say this in a different way. Don't assume that you're smart as you think you are, maybe, right? As you're going along and saying, I know how this is going to go, even when you kind of map out the project, because like you just said, you're going to go along, you're like, oh, wait, I didn't expect that, or there's something new is going to come out of it by moving along that way. And if you think that you just have it perfect from the beginning, you're kind of setting yourself up probably for a lot of pain, because now you're going to have to shift direction along the way, and maybe you weren't anticipating that, or now it's harder to explain away why you had to do that, rather than just modeling it in that more experimental fashion. So I want to get to the last part here, because I want to keep us all on schedule.
Sure.
And so this is a shift gears quite a bit. So I happen to be a big Stephen King fan. I have been reading a ton of Stephen King now. So I'm keeping Amazon pretty happy with the constant flow. Now, this guy writes some crazy stories. If anybody's ever read Stephen King, I don't know how his mind comes up with this stuff. But Mike, so imagine, when you do a book, they do some kind of research usually for the book too. And so imagine Stephen King, he calls you and he says, because he wants to do some research about a new story, And this story is someone loses all their skills and knowledge about analytics, except for one thing that they get to keep. So I know it sounds incredibly frightening. But what is the most valuable skill you have when it comes to analytics, and what would it mean if you were to lose it?
So that's an interesting one. I'd have to say the most useful skill that I have is questioning, and that can either come in a post-sales world while you're formulating what the problem statement is to drive toward what you're going to solve and what the solution is. On a sales side, it's more discovery questions, so you're trying to find out does the customer or the prospect that I'm talking to have enough pain where what I'm trying to sell would help them and solve problems? Because regardless, both of those scenarios, you're still solving problems. So questioning would just discovery skills and questioning skills would be the thing that I would want to hold on to the most.
So I think I agree in many ways that's important, but I want to dig into that a little bit more because I want to get more tangible. So
Okay.
the idea of questioning, right? What is that? How do you get good at that, right? Because it's easy to say, oh, question people.
Better questions. Yeah, right. What does that mean?
Right? How do you? That's not necessarily something you just know how to do. It sounds simple, but I know from my own experience, it's something you have to develop. So how does somebody, either improve? Maybe they do some, but they're improve. Or how does someone who's used to maybe just taking requirements, right? And someone comes in and says, I want this, 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 and this, and they write it down, right? And then they go off, right? And there's not a lot of that. How does someone build that capability for themselves?
I had heard this phrase a while ago, and it stuck with me. It puts a bit of urgency on the questioning too. So just imagine in a few hours, you are going to have to take over the job of the person that you're speaking to. What are you going to ask them that you would need to know to do their job?
Ooh, that's a good one.
So it drives, to take it from another angle, it really drives to just have curiosity to ask the customer questions. You made the example of someone giving you a series of requirements. So just dig into the requirements, see how they tie together, see how they tie to the external world. Because sometimes you'll find out from a requirement standpoint, some requirements are negotiable, some are not negotiable. The negotiation point from software delivery helps you drive it toward the superpowers of the software that you're working with. Because if you ever had a project where your requirements don't really fit with what the software does, it's just not going to work very well.
Sure.
So you either change the software or you change the requirements. Now for the non-negotiable ones, you find out, well, why are they so important? Are those the cornerstones to what this problem is that you're looking to solve? And again, tying it with the external world, as far as who are you relying on, or your customer relying on to get your inputs? And then from the output perspective, what's happening with them? What's the effect? So if you stopped this, what would happen?
Yeah, I love that. I love that question. So taking it one step further, it sounds like it requires some preparation, right? Because if I'm going to be that, if you're the person, right, that I'm going to speak with and put ourselves in that position, I can't just come in and start, winging things, winging out questions. I probably need to come in and say, oh, well, okay, I got to think from Mike's perspective, right, and come in that way. The flip side, though, I really want to hear a little bit about, get your guidance. So if we're in a culture, right, because again, back to this cultural kind of interactions, if our environment and previous interactions, especially, have been where you come in and tell me what to do, right?
Mhm.
And I sat there and I got all my questions for Mike ready, and I started asking questions, and you're like, I don't have time for your questions. Here's what I need you to do.
Mhm.
How do I make sure that that doesn't, well, you can't guarantee it won't happen, but how do I get ready for that meeting and get you ready for that meeting so we can have a more productive conversation?
Hmm. Um, as far as having preparation for this, if this is like a project, that definitely helps, because you are getting into much more detail than you are when you're trying to figure out, will my software help a customer solve their problem? So that's at a conceptual level. And I'd argue you need a little bit of preparation. All the preparation helps, but from an efficiency standpoint, there's plenty of times where I've just walked in cold and started asking questions from the customer. In the in a more of a project sense, that first set of meetings, I've usually tried to set up a structure for further conversations, because you can't be blindly reliant upon what the requirements are, because, just like we were talking about in the beginning, people going through 10 iterations to finally get where they need to go. You're expecting them to do that with an even larger system,
Right.
or a larger problem. So chances are they're not going to get it right. So just having a structure of whether it's status reviews, where you can start and essentially start going over the requirements and seeing how your progress has affected the requirements, and how now their new understanding, based upon getting some initial steps done, can change the requirements, is the important thing for those larger efforts.
Yeah. So that's good. So I think that is good advice, because you're basically saying, look, you set the ground rules very early on,
Mm-hmm.
right? Or of how you think it's going to go. So it's deeper than a project plan, right? Because you can say that that's the work, but now you're saying, look, I recognize that as we go through this, maybe we're going to do it this way,
Mm-hmm.
and can solve those kind of things. And plus, maybe you're doing it in a team environment where it's
Mm-hmm.
not you and I having that negotiation, and the team says, okay, because it's not going to be one instance either, right? It's probably going to be more of a way that the project happens. And I recognize that this also will, right, if it's new to an organization, it may take a few projects before these kinds of things sink in, and
Mm-hmm.
where now it's just, okay, yeah, let's just do it, right? You've changed it, but
Yeah.
that initial time, it takes a lot more work. Unfortunately, it has to happen while you're also maybe using a new technology. There's a lot of things happening at the same time, but you kind
Well,
of have to deal.
yeah, look at the last time you bought furniture and you had it moved into the room, and you look at it and say, no, that doesn't work there. Then you have to move everything around again. You have this idea in your head of how something is supposed to look once you've completed the plan, and it doesn't work out. And that's okay, unless there's an overturn policy on the couch. But but generally with projects, if you do it incremental enough, it's not that big of a step backwards where it's catastrophic.
So is the lesson to go on a furniture shopping trip with your team before you start a project?
That might help, yeah. At least IKEA, because I heard they have good restaurants in there. They'll spend at least
Cool.
$4.
Well, we're at our mark here, so I want to be friendly to everybody's time, and especially yours, Mike. So thanks for digging in on some really interesting topics. I think you got some very practical things people can take away from how to think about some of the team interactions, and as they're working with, it doesn't just have to be new technologies. I think it's on any kind of work you're doing with your teams or other teams, and or even customers. These are some good lessons of a few little changes we can make to make everything better for ourselves. So thanks again, everybody. We'll have this up for a replay in a few days. And just to close out, we have another session on Thursday, same time, with Jordan Morrow, who's the head of data literacy at Click. And check out for some other upcoming folks we have over the next few weeks. Thanks again.
Thanks for having me. Have a good day.